So, we're going to watch Overview of the Occult Movement, 5/12/19, uploaded by Lover's Lane, Church of Christ. I am omitting some introductory portions involving singing and prayers. We're going right into the talk.
Throughout the years, I have studied the occult movement, and I have learned that it is a complex movement. It's not always easy to identify. Many times when we think about occultism, we think about astrology and palm reading and witchcraft, and certainly these are part of the occult movement, but they're really only a small part of it. And not only that, our ignorance of this subject matter, I think, has caused us to have a poor understanding of a lot of things.
I'd like a little specified context on our ignorance, those words.
Including demonology and the Bible's teachings in regard to this matter. We seem to be fixed on concentrating on the matter of demons possessing humans, which ended long time ago, no longer exist, and yet have left the other matters and dangers associated with it.
Right. Because if anybody's going to do any killing, it better be God, not those demons.
Some of the facets of liberalism that we are facing in our world are really a product of new thought.
It's not a new thought to put your focus elsewhere. Because you have to remember, when you say God, as generic a term as that is, you mean this specific God of this specific religion that flourished in that particular part of the world at a certain time that happened to get popular.
And I think this it helps explain why masses of people have taken their focus off of God. And most of these extreme movements now are dominating in the alternative religions that really have come out of the occult movement.
Extreme. What is he calling extreme?
Our poor understanding of demonology and even our relegation of it in the Old Testament have caused us to believe that we really have nothing to fear from demons in the day and time in which we live. And yet, the demons are the propagators of the lies of the devil himself.
And how did you get to demonology? What does astrology have to do with demonology exactly? What does divination of any kind have to do with it? And what's the difference between divination and prophecy? Because we have to throw out at least half of the Bible.
The occult movement in America has a history and it has a heritage. It was born and propagated in the early years of American history in an area that was known as the Burned Over District. Carl Kramer called this area the broad psychic highway, a thoroughfare of the occult.
Very true. But I would ask that everybody keep in mind throughout this video and any other that we look at in the future, the meaning of the word occult. Hidden. Secret. Kept hidden that which is hidden. And ask yourself, why is it hidden? It had to go into hiding. This stuff, all of it, had to go into hiding. Otherwise, the church and its agents are coming to torture and kill you.
The Burned Over District occupies an area approximately 25 miles wide and extending 300 miles long in the western part of New York. It extends from Albany in the east to Buffalo in the west. It was called the Burned Over District because it had been so heavily evangelized that they claimed that there was no fuel, that is, no people who were not converted left, and so they called it burned over, that it in essence had burned out. Now, these conversions were not to traditional mainstream religions per se, but often they were conversions to newly emerging religious movements, almost always tied to the occult in one way or the other. It is this poor understanding of the connections to the occult that have caused us to misunderstand a lot of what is happening, not only in the world in general, but also in the religious world. This area gave movement to such religions as Mormonism, as the Millerites, sometimes called the Seventh-day Adventists, the Shakers, the Oneida Society, as well as a large number of various utopian groups.
Are you calling them utopian in a negative sense? Isn't that the point of your religion? The quote-unquote heavenly reward? Teaching that you should do things to get to heaven as a reward instead of just the knowledge of doing good for the sake of doing good.
The Fox sisters and the Spiritualist movement began there. Neo-Pentecostalism and other perfectionist movements. The women's rights movement.
Hold on.
The women's rights movement.
We're going to hear that again. Hold on a second.
The women's rights movement.
Basically, he just inadvertently admitted that he's afraid of women and of women making decisions. And of course, women having any kind of not only spiritual power, but authority.
Every aspect of the occult, including every form of divination, originated in America there.
Again, every form of divination? Now you're going to have to get rid of all the prophecy and prophets that occur throughout the Old and New Testament. That's at least half of your so-called holy book. Get rid of it because you just called it wrong, evil, and abomination.
God clearly declares in his word that he's totally opposed to witchcraft and casting of spells.
I don't know. Where does he say that? Let's get this quote right.
He says it in Deuteronomy 18 and verse 10. Let no one be found among you who sacrifices his son or daughter in the fire, who practices divination or sorcery, interprets omens, engages in witchcraft or casts spells, or who is a medium or spiritist, or who consults the dead.
Well, to begin with, certainly we will not do any sacrifices.
Yeah, you said that.
Except that one.
Amongst the Hebrews, their own prophets and prophetesses practiced exactly that which is being condemned there.
Divination.
Think about that. They practiced divination.
Yes.
Prophecy is divination. It's exactly the same thing.
New Thought, the Free Love Movement, the Forder's Utopian Socialist Movement, and the Social Gospel, the Christian Scientism, the old perfectionist camp meeting revivals, the Black Liberation Movement.
Hold on.
The Black Liberation Movement, the folk religion and magic, and more and more. Now, I wish you would just listen for a moment at that list of all of these different ways of thinking and religions.
Good idea. Let's do that. Can you do that honestly?
All of which go back to the occultism that really sprang forth in our country in the state of New York. In order to understand this movement and facets, we need to have a clear understanding of its meaning and its identity.
We're agreed on something.
The word occult is derived from a Latin word, occultus. It means that is hidden or secret. And the basic idea is that there are secret ways of knowing and secret things to know, and that there are mystical doorways of realization, and if you know how to access these, then you're able to gain knowledge that other people simply do not have.
You're able to do that with the Bible too. You know that, right? That's why it was written. Astrotheology, humanized stories of the stars like other myths.
It refers to knowledge that is beyond the range of ordinary knowledge or understanding, and thus it is mysterious. The claim is that this secret knowledge must be kept secret for certain select people who are empowered some way to know what others do not know. It is this type of thinking that had a great impact even on the early church. It would be found in the mystery religions, in Gnosticism, and therefore any information not ascertained by ordinary means of getting knowledge would really come under the heading of that which is occultic.
Again, true. Very true. That's the whole point.
Now, while the occult is a maze of interconnecting philosophies and concepts, there are certain fundamental ideas that they are seen to have in common. They are often Luciferian.
They often do involve the planet Venus and light. Yes. They even have things in common with, again, your holy book.
They believe that hidden messages and teachings are continually occurring. They believe in an active, unseen world that adepts can access to their own advantage.
All they have to do to become empowered in the way that you say it is to want to know. Decide to seek the knowledge that has been forbidden by an evil God. That's all.
They are almost always social people who are promoters of various social movements.
No, that's anybody's guess.
They believe in humanism, in which every person is his own God, or they can become a God.
Again, no. You'd have to take a survey. I don't have the numbers on that, but that's only guesswork on my part as much as yours.
They believe in various doctrines associated with the veneration of the dead, ranging all the way from communication with the dead to redemption of the dead.
Again, just like you in the Bible, particularly with Jesus. He rose from the dead, didn't he? He communicated with people after that fact, didn't he? Okay, we have something in common.
Which, by the way, would be one of the cardinal doctrines of the Mormon Church, the vicarious baptism of the dead, this fixation with the dead, and genealogy.
It's not a fixation. It's a reverence.
There is a special emphasis on mind power and self-awareness.
Is that negative? Everybody reflect on those words for a moment and tell me what is wrong with mental power and self-awareness.
There is a belief in demon communication and direction.
I'm sure in some corners of the world there are. You, like so many others, are in quite a hurry to make a connection with demons and us, aren't you? Although you're the only one who's talking about it so much.
There is even a discussion about the so-called hidden masters who control everything.
According to Helena Blavatsky, it is. And there's even differing ideas of who she was talking about.
When looking at the occult, it is vitally important to remember that anything which teaches supernatural revelation separate and apart from the Bible is actually occultic. And anything which teaches that there is a hidden knowledge that can be obtained by money or by some connection with occultism, all of this fits within this umbrella.
Why and how did money sneak into that? What does money have to do with it? It's like demons in your own imagination. You just kind of slipped that in there. I wasn't thinking about money or demons on this subject until you brought it up.
Anything that teaches that we either are gods or that we can become gods is occultic. Again, another part of the Mormon religion.
Jesus taught it. He said, "All these things I do, you too can do, and more." In other words, you can do more than I've done that you've witnessed here in my lifetime. Take this. You do it too. Do good things with it.
Anything that teaches or encourages communication with the dead is occultic. Anything which advocates Luciferianism. Luciferianism teaches that Jesus and Lucifer were brothers. Some, for example, like the Mormons, say that they were actually created brothers. They relegate the godhood of the second person of Godhead to a created being. And it also teaches that the God of heaven is the bad God and that Lucifer is the good God. It also teaches that Lucifer is the God who gives enlightenment, and God the Father is a bad God who wants people to remain ignorant.
Even Jehovah, God himself, acknowledges that it's already happening with Adam and Eve. He turns to another God, his peer. It's somebody he speaks to as an equal. And he says, now these two, Adam and Eve, have become as we are. Who's we? Well, he wasn't lying when he called himself a jealous God, was he? He wants the knowledge that he and his unnamed buddies have to remain only known to them. Remember, folks, knowledge is power. There's a reason that line is so often quoted. He tells us so himself. Leave the tree of the knowledge of good and evil alone, while Lucifer is the light bearer, bringing light into darkness, leading us toward knowledge. The Bible tells us, without any occultism whatsoever, straightforward. He is the bright morning star. What's that? That's the planet Venus, as seen in the early morning hours. Very simple stuff.
And finally, anything that teaches enlightenment in a way that is not ordinary or that is supernatural or that is apperceptive is certainly occultic.
Okay, are you about to insinuate that Lucifer and Satan are the same figure? Because they are not.
So this movement, which began in the burned-over district in America, began a revolution in religion and secular thinking that has been felt around the entire world, and that has changed the face of religion and politics and culture and radically changed the world's view of God, Satan, and the Bible.
Again, with this one extreme or the other kind of thinking, this totally good figure and totally bad figure. So black and white. I don't buy it for a second, none of it.
In fact, its influence is so great that by the 1970s, it had so influenced religion, politics, culture, and social thought that it was given a new name. It was then known as New Age or New Age thought.
True.
Most of the mega churches like Joel Osteen and his people are actually New Age, New Thought churches.
No, I take issue with that. I think I see why you say it, but I take issue with that. I reject him as much as I reject what you're saying. Plus, I know for a fact he doesn't like to help people.
Things like Norman Vincent Peale's positive thinking, Edgar Cayce's meditation, yoga have become alternative treatments. All of these were actually born from occultism.
You're not going to say that yoga is evil, are you? Are you? I'll deal with that when it comes. Norman Vincent Peale is okay. He just combined a lot of different practices together and made it consumptive for the ordinary person. He's all right. Edgar Cayce is great.
Even the U.S. Army has gotten into the picture. This adage that was so popular about 2 decades ago, be all that you can be, actually came from the Army's attempt to create a New Age army.
That term, New Age, is problematic in any context.
In fact, the Army War College in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, worked to create what is called the New Age Army.
A New Age army. Again, think about those words sandwiched together. New Age army. Peace, love, and let's kill each other. Because that makes sense.
In 1877, the Equal Rights Party named a trance medium by the name of Victoria Woodhull the nation's first female presidential candidate. Sometimes when we look at the equal rights movement and things like that,
oh boy,
we believe that this was simply the product of a social, of some social movement and this upheaval, or that might be associated with it. Nothing could be further from the truth. The equal rights movement and all associated with it was born in the occult movement. and socialism that would be so rampant would really begin right then and there.
So, not only the women's rights movement, but we're saying equal rights movement? The far broader term, equal rights movement. Are we leaving that open-ended, open context? You're telling me that's to be feared also? I'll give you the benefit of doubt. Let's find out.
She was the first woman to appear before a joint committee of Congress, and she told her supporters that her testimony had been dictated to her in a dream by a ghostly tunic-wearing Greek elder who was a spirit who had guarded her and guided her since she was a little girl.
The first female candidate for president in the United States was a woman named Victoria Woodhull, who herself was a lifelong spirit medium. She was nominated for the presidency in 1872 by a protest party called the Equal Rights Party. She rose to national prominence because she was a spirit medium, and she was also a passionate and eloquent advocate for suffragism. And in 1871, Victoria Woodhull became the first woman to address a joint session of Congress. She addressed a joint meeting of both the Senate and the House Judiciary Committee. And she gave an impassioned talk calling for equal voting rights. And this talk was known as the Woodhull Memorial, the Woodhull Memorial. It stands up really well as a really elegant piece of American oration. She sounds almost like Thomas Paine. She's very persuasive, very convincing. And if you look up the Woodhull Memorial later tonight, you can read it. You can find it on your phone. And after the speech, because again, reporters were sort of astonished that a woman could deliver such an impassioned and elegant piece of public oration, reporters asked her where her inspiration came from, obviously thinking that she was going to say, "Oh, my hubby wrote it for me," or something like that. And she said, with a completely straight and commanding demeanor to reporters, that the speech was dictated to her in a dream by this ghostly Greek figure wearing a robe who had been her spirit guide ever since she had been a little girl. And this was reported in the newspapers. She had no embarrassment about this whatsoever. She rose to national prominence, and so she was named by the Equal Rights Party as their presidential candidate. I don't know, frankly, that she ever appeared on a single state ballot. It was a protest candidacy. And in all fairness, Victoria could be kind of slippery. She named the abolitionist hero Frederick Douglass as her running mate. And when reporters asked Douglass about this, he said to them, "I never heard of any of this." And he was completely sort of nonplussed and what? And that was also a part of Victoria's character.
In 1854, Senator James Shields of Illinois rose to the Senate floor to present a petition signed by 15,000 American spiritualists requesting funding for an investigation concerning the possibility of talking to the dead. He wanted them to build what he called a spiritual telegraph between the material and the spiritual world. And amazingly, in 1920, Thomas Edison told a reporter that he was building a machine to communicate with the dead. None of us know what happened to that machine. Now, let's get an overview of the occult that came out of the burned over district. First of all, you have the Shakers. Sometimes they were called Shaking Quakers. Mother Ann Lee was the leader of it. Though from England, Anne Lee would reach her fame in the burn-over district throughout the entire world. She claimed that angels spoke to her and she saw visions of the dead, that the Holy Spirit sent her spinning on one leg and dancing and jumping away her sins. She prophesied, claiming that God had given her secret knowledge. And even after she died in 1784, the Shakers believed that Mother Ann was sending them messages from the other world. She believed that she was the Mother God, and she was the female manifestation of Christ, which, by the way, would be blasphemy. And because of hidden messages, communication with the dead, prophecies, these apperceptive things, Shakerism would be born in that district, and it would be one of the early manifestations of occultism. Joseph Smith was a Mason, which means that he was an occultist. It's impossible to be a Mason without being an occultist.
He was also a scam artist.
He created his new religion, Mormonism, on the Luciferian concept of Gnosticism and Masonism.
I just want to let that term soak in for a minute. I have never heard Masonism before. I had the opportunity to hear Tucker Carlson refer to something called Wiccanism, and that was a strange pleasure to hear. Masonism. I'm going to remember that one.
He actually stole the rituals of the Masons, incorporated them into the Mormon religion, claiming to have received revelation from an angel called Moroni, who directed him to golden plates that he alleged helped interpret, and that he interpreted those plates.
True story. He's telling it well.
He taught that Jesus and Lucifer were sexually created sons of God and thus were brothers. He claimed that Lucifer was good and that Lucifer told Eve the truth in the Garden of Eden. And he claimed that God wanted to keep Eve in darkness, and that Lucifer, the good God, brought her light so that she could become a god.
Okay, here's where we part ways. That last part is true. That's not a claim. Read the Bible yourself. See for yourself which one lied to her. Eat of this fruit and you shall surely die. They didn't die. The serpent said, it's knowledge. Take that. The serpent was at home in the garden, in this forest. Nature, the spirit of nature, serpent wisdom. And then this violent God, self-described as jealous, comes along and says, no, all this natural beauty, this can't happen. Read it yourself. One of them is a liar, one of them is not. It's amazing that people don't see what's right there. They choose not to see.
How many people are involved in the Mormon religion even grasp that they are an integral part of the Luciferian movement in the world? Mormonism is a religion based on the idea of God making, which is a central theme of the occult movement. The Mormon path to godhood involves secret rituals introduced by Smith that must be performed. Before the Mormon revelation, of course, Joe Smith was a seer stone glass looker. And he would allegedly look in a stone or peer in a stone, and he claimed that this would lead him to lost gold and Indian treasures. He was so committed to the occult that he wore the occult Jupiter medallion throughout his entire life. And when he was murdered, this talisman was around his neck. The Jupiter talisman had 3 pagan deities engraved in it. Mormonism is one of the most occult religions on the face of the earth.
The planets connection, just remember this. If that's true, I don't know about that part. The Jupiter medallion. Okay. Jehovah is planet Jupiter. Satan, Saturn. Lucifer, Venus. Why Jupiter? Because it's the biggest of all the planets. You've heard people that remind you of Santa Claus, maybe, described as jovial. Well, they're of Jove. Jove is another word for Jehovah and Jupiter. It's a well-regarded planet, and it protects us all the time from being struck by meteors. I'm sorry, that's where it comes from. It's not my fault that that's true. So he just inadvertently put down his own God. Don't regard the planet Jupiter in this way, but he does it every day in church. Jesus Christ is the sun moving through the 12 houses of the zodiac, which show up as the 12 stations of the cross. Again, it's not my fault that that's true. It's just information that nobody wants to know about. I don't know why they don't want to know about it. Maybe if their God didn't condemn the tree of knowledge, they'd eat of it happily and share in the joy of knowledge sharing. But let's go on.
The Millerites were the followers of a man by the name of William Miller. Millerites are what we know today as the Adventist movement, like, for example, the Seventh-day Adventists.
Okay, I'm just going to let him tell this story because I have nothing to say about Seventh-day Adventists.
Like Joe Smith, Miller was a Freemason and a Baptist preacher. And though a deist in the beginning, he claimed that he had received knowledge of the Bible that other people simply had not had. Again, this hidden knowledge. They know something the rest of us don't know.
Doesn't have to be that way. You're welcome to know it, but you worship a God who doesn't want you to know it. And you're telling us how evil all this occult stuff is. So don't be condescending to people who hold a claim to knowledge you don't have. They're not saying you can't have it or you're not undeserving of it. Your God does, and you support that God in that decision. That's on you, not us.
And this previously unseen and unknown knowledge allowed him to predict that Jesus would return to the earth somewhere between March 21st, 1849 and March 21st, 1851. And of course, that did not happen. And so Miller would revise the dates and say, well, no, I got the dates wrong, but he's still coming, and then he would predict times. And you would have thought that this ended the Millerite movement, because when a man is predicting actual dates and things don't occur, you'd think people would say, well, this guy's a fraud, but that's not the case. Really, it set the stage for a woman to come along by the name of Ellen G. White, and she was a Millerite follower. And she claimed that she had a vision like all the other occultists, and this vision would lead to what we now know as the Adventist movement, including the Seventh-day Adventist Church, which, by the way, is the 12th largest religion in the world, boasting over 16 million members. The Neo-Pentecostal movement had its beginning right there in the burned-over district. It was the product of a very important thing to make a mental note of. It was a product of the perfectionist movement. If the perfectionist movement is one of the most dangerous movements that the world has ever known. One of the most important things to understand is the significance of the perfectionist movement and its influence both on religion, politics, and culture around the world. In fact, this movement has not only led to the damnation of millions, it has also led to the genocide of tens of millions. John Wesley, the founder of the Methodist religion, was also the father of the modern holiness Pentecostal movements.
Isn't it interesting that the Pentecostals are daring themselves? They have such a relationship with who else but the serpent? It's like this dance they're doing with their own so-called enemy. Either they know on some level or they want to know.
And all of this really issued from the Methodist movement itself. Notice the word holiness is referring to the movement. You sometimes hear about the holiness movement, the big umbrella. Well, what does it mean? From the beginning, Methodist theology placed great emphasis on the idea that they could know from a crisis experience that they had been saved. One of the great problems of Calvinism is you claim that God has chosen you to be saved, not others but you, but how do you know that? Wesley wrote and revised a tract entitled A Plain Account of Christian Perfectionists as Believed and Taught by the Reverend Mr. John Wesley. Now remember that the emphasis is on the experience, and in this tract Wesley taught that there were two separate phases of experience for the believer. First, there was conversion or justification, and second, there was Christian perfection or sanctification. In the first experience, the penitent person was forgiven for the actual sins upon becoming a Christian, but he retained a residue of sin within, and the remaining inbred sin was the result of Adam's fall and had to be dealt with by a second blessing, which would give perfection. Wesley called this a second work of grace, and the entire two-phase process was called the double cure. You ever heard that? The double cure? Well, by the way, if you've ever sung the song Rock of Ages, be of sin the double cure, saved from wrath and made me pure, then you've just sung the false doctrine of Wesley's double cure perfectionist doctrine.
What a waste of time. Okay, you are so much better off. Just rid yourself of this whole sin concept. Get rid of it. There is no sin. There is only crime. It's very simple. You don't need that book for it. Don't hurt anyone, physically or mentally or emotionally or psychologically, or their property, and be cool. And that's all there is to it.
Beginning with camp meetings, which began in the early 1800s, the plea of religious experience and perfectionism began to sweep from the west, from the burned over district as far west as could possibly be. The famous Cane Ridge camp meetings were characterized by people falling down and jerking and barking like dogs and falling into trances and having what they called the holy laugh, and they would dance around like they were crazy. Separate and apart from camp meetings, circuit riding preachers penetrated every corner of the frontier, preaching this new perfectionist doctrine.
Wow, that's a lot of peas. I'll leave the penetrating preacher jokes alone.
And as soon as the penitent had recovered from the ordeal of conversion, they were plunged into the agony of seeking for perfection.
More peas.
As Wesley said, the sanctified soul, through careful self-examination, godly discipline, and methodical devotion.
I'm very uncomfortable with the way he said that and gestured with methodical. Should devotion be methodical? Ritualistic, I understand and know and feel the significance, but methodical doesn't really belong with devotion in a pure, sincere way. That was an interesting choice of words to slap together.
An avoidance of worldly pleasure could live a life of victory over sin.
But why would you? It's part of what we're here to do, worldly pleasure. By the way, this is a Taurus speaking.
Now, Christians can be victorious over sin, but it's not because they're perfect. It's because they are forgiven. And while it is true that Christians can live a life that is in harmony with the will of God, they can never do that simply by their own will. They must do it by this precious blood of Jesus Christ that keeps on keeping a Christian sinless. Not because they have not because they don't commit sin, but because they have been forgiven of the sins that they have committed.
No wonder then that they get away perpetually with so much beneath the veneer of creepy smiles and keeping up appearances.
This chore of perfectionism was not only impossible, but it would absolutely wear you out. So in 1839, a Miss Phoebe Palmer of New York City began to teach a shorter way of achieving perfectionism than through a lifetime of hard work. She said that one could attain instant perfection by baptism of the Holy Spirit. So Mr. and Mrs. Palmer, for the next 30 years, were the national leaders of the new way to Wesley's perfectionism, which evolved into what we now know as the Holiness Pentecostal movement. So the first periodical devotion exclusively to the holiness doctrine was published in 1839, and it was called The Guide to Christian Perfection.
Are we ever going to get out of the 19th century? Or New York? Because we have a lot to cover, and we're just past the halfway mark of this video.
Now, let's get this straight. When you're involved in Wesleyism and you're involved in the Neo-Pentecostal movement and the holiness movement, you're involved in a purely occult religion. It is a religion of impossibility, of perfectionism. And later they changed their name to the Guide to Holiness, because the word perfection taught that humans could be perfect and no thinking person that has any sense at all could ever believe it. So they substituted the word holiness. But even though they substituted the word holiness means the perfectionism of Wesleyism.
Wait, are you saying that's what it means? Or are you telling us about how that's what it means to them? Because that's not what it means. Whatever the context, it has a different, unique definition.
They had all property in common. No one owned anything for themselves. They practice a concept called stirpiculture, which was a selective breeding program designed to create the perfect children. If you want to know where Adolf Hitler came up with some of these ideas, they were around a long time before he lived on this earth. He borrowed these ideas, and the melting pot and the stirring pot for all of it was our country. This experiment that Noah's had led to the birth of 58 children, 9 of whom were fathered by Noah himself. So it was here that the Burnover district that the ideas of utopianism and communism were born, all of it deriving from the false idea of perfectionism. And it would be here that the first experiments to produce perfect children would be born. Again, all of this paving the way both for Nazism and communism, leading to the torture and brutality and the ethnic cleansing and eventual death of millions and millions of people.
Right, because the church has never been responsible for the deaths of millions of people, have they?
Now, I want to tell you something, and if you don't know it, you need to listen very carefully. This old earth that we live on will never be perfect. The only time that it had perfection was in the Garden of Eden, and all that ended because of sin.
That last statement. Listen to what he said and how he worded it. He just summarized the thinking of so many people. This is why the natural world is getting torn to shreds, and the mind of man is getting stamped on it in its place.
The world will never be perfect. And these attempts to make it perfect are absolutely futile, and they have led to some of the greatest atrocities that the world has ever known. You know, the Shakers had prophesied that spirits would visit every city and hamlet, every palace and college in the land, and at Rochester, New York, in the burned over district. It seemed like these visitations would come in different ways. And thus you would have the birth led by people like the Fox sisters of what would be the Spiritualist movement. Many people don't realize that early on in the Spiritualist movement that there was a preacher in Nashville, Tennessee, a preacher of the church, who became one of the leading advocates of spiritualism. And it was at that, this man was so popular that there was a feeling that he might actually leave the church in this way. Fortunately, he was stopped. A woman named Jemima Wilkinson claimed that she died October 1, 1776, and came back to life 36 hours later. And after her resurrection, she said that she would respond to no other name but the public universal friend. That was her name. Andrew Jackson Davis, very famous man, was born August 11th, 1826 at Blooming Grove, New York. He claimed that on a winter night in 1844, he was transported in a trance over the frozen Hudson River, taken to a graveyard where he encountered the spirit of Emanuel Swedenborg. Swedenborg allegedly told Davis that he would be a bearer of a new light. And he dictated a book while in the trance called The Principles of Nature, Her Divine Revelation, and a Vow to Mankind. And this book was a joining of Utopianism, Mesmerism, the Swedenborg doctrine, into a single occult religion.
You can cherry pick all you like. You take a few people, that's apparently what this is all about. You take a few people, you tear them down on their personality and what they did socially and how we remember them, and show a connection between all of them and the occult. And then you say, look, this is what it's all about. I'm not going to point to, and I don't, priests who rape children and get away with it with a slap on the wrist from their superiors and say, look, this is what all Catholics are like, because I know that's not true. Is this your ultimate point?
Davis was married 3 times, but his second wife was a woman, rights radical by the name of Mary Finn Lowe, who in 1853 convened the first New York State Women's Right Convention. What's fascinating is that these people ran under the banner of trying to give women the vote.
As equals. I want to skip to the chase too and past it. And I wish I could force you to answer what specifically do you have a problem with regarding women in a position of spiritual power. And not in the way of having power over people, like the way you describe demons and devils. Just power, the kind of thing you have.
But underneath all those claims of giving women the vote was this horrid, occultic undercurrent, all of which was designed to lead to perfectionism and to lead to socialism and to lead to concepts of equality that have never existed and never will exist. Now, I don't care what humans may do to try to teach an idea that we're all equal. We're really not all equal. Some people are short, some people are tall, some people are beautiful, some people are ugly, some people are extremely brilliant, some are dull, and you could make a list as long as your leg.
That's a very specific reference. Why would it be as long as my leg?
All of these people are important, and these distinctions make no difference unless you're part of a perfectionist thing that says, oh, it's bad to be tall, or it's bad to be short, or it's bad to have this, and it's bad to have that. So once that comes into play, you create a mechanism whereby a handful of people in the world can determine what is normal. And for Hitler, it was blonde-headed, blue-eyed people. And everybody else just didn't count. And they not only didn't count, they didn't even deserve to be around.
No comment necessary. The Hitler analogy. You know, it was the Catholic Church who decided to not renounce him. I encourage everybody, in fact, to look into exactly what the Vatican did with and for the Nazis during and just before World War II.
Nettie Maynard was a trance medium, and she claimed that she went into a trance in Abraham Lincoln's private quarters and convinced him to sign the Emancipation Proclamation. Fred B. Robinson, during the Great Depression, became rich by peddling New Thought, teaching. He would take out these ads in the American magazine proclaiming, and this was his famous adage, that he talked to God. And he claimed that if you sent him $20, which is a lot of money in that day and time, he'd talk to God for you. This was the first time in America that religion taught that you can get what you want from God by paying money. Now religion is strewn about, controlled by money and power and all this idea of concentration on self. That's what the mega churches are all about. The mega churches are the product of all the things that we've been studying about this morning.
Excellent point. Excellent point. Church leaders do that all the time throughout the history of the church. I wanted that one to really sink in too.
And finally, there was Marcus Garvey, the first black nationalistic leader. Garvey was an occultist who joined politics, the occult, and religion in what would be known as the black nationalist movement. He taught pure new thought. Garvey believed that God had failed to free the black man, and so he needed to help God out by teaching the black folks total self-reliance and not reliance upon God. He believed in demons that could help you do whatever you wanted and whatever you needed. In other words, if you need help, don't go to God for help, go to the demons. And I do want to mention very quickly two other important people. One of these men was Henry Wallace. He was the vice president of the United States under FDR. Wallace believed in uniting all religions into one religion based upon the occult. Wallace, more than any other person, used his power to codify the connection between socialism and occultism. In fact, it was Wallace who, along with Roosevelt, gave us our dollar bill. And the American dollar bill is a purely occultic bill. The symbols on it, the symbolism, Wallace was the man behind it. Most Americans don't realize that the dollar bill in their pocket has a really coded message.
And if they want to know the full story, look into the occult. Occult investigation does precisely that. Uncovers. But it doesn't just say, this means this. That means that. Nothing's that simple. The understanding of it, of the great mysteries, come with patience. And it's not as if secrets are just being kept because somebody decides not to say them. No, some of them cannot be given. They cannot. It's not a choice. It's just there's no way of conveying it. You come to an understanding that anybody who wants to know has to come to understand it for themselves. Besides, if what you consider to be proof is simply looking in an old book, well, some of us require much more than that. It's going to take more than looking in an old book and saying, aha, so-and-so said so right here.
That explains the idea of the great architect, the free Masonic idolatrous God, this idea of creating a new world order that we are now witnessing. You know, the new world order, people don't hide it anymore. They're globalists. They're proud of it, and they're pushing. And we are in a great crisis in the world. And then I want to mention one other person. Henry Steele Olcott was one of the chief investigators in the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. He was a farmer, an inventor, and a lawyer who, along with a very famous woman, Madame Blavatsky, became the leading occultist in the world. In fact, the Buddhist nation of Ceylon enshrined his image on a postage stamp, and they mark his death annually with a national holiday. That's how important it was. I hope by just simply touching the hem of the garment that I have made you aware of a movement that has many fingers and many arms, a movement that has influenced every facet of our lives, whether we know it or not, and continues to do so. And when you now look at the streams of thought that are like oceans of water carrying culture this way or that, every one of them will go right back to the burned over district of New York. Every one of them came from that area, the rancid, cancerous occult movement that now has swept the entire world in ways that were uniquely different than prior to that time.
You don't say.
So, by 1840, perfectionism was becoming one of the central themes of American social, intellectual, and religious life. And this resulted in the creation of various utopian societies and really communistic movements in America. Communism was not born in Russia. Communism actually began in America. It was also funded by some of the titans, some of the richest people in our country. There probably would have never been a communist movement had there not been these communist socialistic ideas that were growing right and left, and people who believed in some sort of utopian type of idea. Not only can people be perfected, but according to this doctrine, entire countries and communities could eventually be made perfect. They could become utopic. In 1872, the Equal Rights Party named Victoria Woodhull the nation's first female presidential candidate, and there were followers, as I mentioned a moment ago about her. There were followers. This Charles Fourier, who founded this utopic commune, but the most famous and by the way the most enduring of these communities is the Oneida community. It was founded in 1848 by a man by the name of John Humphrey Knowles. And Knowles was a graduate of Dartmouth and later studied at Andover and Yale. And he came to believe that we no longer need the Bible. We just need direct revelation, occultism.
Now, explain to me the problem with that. We don't need it. We don't need the Bible. I don't want it burned any more than any other book. But we don't need it. And yes, we do only need direct revelation. That's what it's all about. How does that become, really, how exactly does that become less important than just trusting the word of someone who had a private revelation several thousand years ago? Just believe. Why? You need to just believe. Just trust in the Lord. Why? Direct revelation. We can all experience it. And Christ says so. But you didn't want us to see those parts of the Bible, did you? It's too bad for you. We've found those parts again. And that we have multiple translations. And that we have comparative mythology. And we can point to the specific other older spiritual traditions from which yours coalesced. Do I need to say it again? It's not my fault that that's true. It just is.
He taught that he had himself been completely perfected, and it was impossible for him to commit sin regardless of what he did.
Well, then he was full of shit, because nobody is like that.
And he called this community the Bible communist. And he taught self-perfection and the idea and the concept of the commune. The loss of self and the joining of the community. They practiced complex marriage. Older women would introduce young men to sex, and older men would introduce young girls to sex. In complex marriage, every man and every woman was married to each other, and they engaged in sexual intercourse at any time, in any place, all of that with the approval of Noyes and the other leaders.
I'm not into it either. I'm just not. But that doesn't make it evil.
You know, ignorance is a terrible thing.
Amen.
And you know, we live our lives and we go from day to day and we kind of get from one thing to another, and our minds are pretty much filled with propaganda and all these ideas and news, most of which is nothing but junk, but some of which is actually designed to keep the propaganda going in our minds, to keep us thinking a certain way or to keep us distracted.
Now, see, it sounds much more like you're talking about Christianity itself.
The average person has no idea of the things I talked to you about this morning. They don't know where this stuff came from. They don't know about the connections. The average Mormon will go to church, has no idea in the world where it came from, what it's all about. And that's just one of them. You go to the mega churches, you have no idea of what it's all about, except it's all about you. It's all about you, not about God. No wonder America is such a selfish society. And yes, we can be generous, but there is even a certain selfishness in our generosity, because it's not always for the purest reasons and the purest motives.
Again, turn that around a bit and it would be a good point. In fact, what you just said reminds me of the fact that I gave to a program, what was it called? The Christian Children's Fund. You know those programs you used to see infomercials all the time where they'd show slow motion scenes of poor, sick children in Africa. They need our help. Won't you give your money today? Well, most of those take your money, and most of it, not all of it, in fact, some of them, not even most of it, just some of the money actually would make it there and benefit them, while a lot of it would also benefit the people running the program. And I've always hated these because along with giving them the things they need, they get force-fed the religion. Here, before you can eat your sandwich, we'd like to tell you about Jesus Christ. I found a program who specifically left religion out of it. They bring food, shelter, medical supplies and necessities, and they bring people to teach people in these extremely poor and in many cases extremely remote communities, teach them how to run these programs themselves, how to grow food themselves. And they don't do it by holding the sandwich hostage for a promise to learn about a specific God. They help people just for the sake of helping people. So what you said about not always the purest reasons and the purest motives, don't you dare put that out on all of us. For 8 years, I was able to contribute to that program. And it was awesome. I wish they all were required to act the same way.
If you're not a Christian, I beg you come today in faith, having heard the Word of God.
Having heard the Word of God, today, now, through you, you didn't quote the Bible. I don't think once this whole time did you quote the Bible. Where was the Word of God?
Believing that word, repenting of sins, confessing that Jesus Christ is the Son of God, and being baptized for remission of sins. And if you are a Christian in need of public confession, please come while we stand and sing.
Okay, we're going to skip the singing again, because my criticism is going to remain only on spoken messages. And that goes for all of these. So I'm skipping to see if he comes back. Okay, so that was all. At least it was an interesting talk. So that was Raymond Hagood preaching. at Lover's Lane Church of Christ. Once again, entitled Overview of the Occult Movement, given on May 12th, 2019. Maybe I'll look him up again in the future. I've never heard of him before. And I want to thank all of my viewers for joining me for this episode in the series of Keep Your Devil, because I don't want him.